you all so much for joining. As we wait just a little bit for everyone to get in and get settled, I'm just going to do a bit of an intro for what we're doing today. So my name is Jimmy. I'm from the marketing team here at Switch, and today we're going to be delivering an awesome webinar with our experts. I call them experts because they know far more than me. So they'll be taking you through this, and I'm here just to make sure we all get this on the road. So this webinar is going to be focused on multifamily. So we're talking tenant and owner charging needs, building and electrical considerations, technology and software, integration requirements, funding incentives, management and care, and lots more. So all of this is going to be focused on multifamily use cases. So please feel free to ask questions on anything we go through today in the webinar. Quickly introducing who's going to be on the call: Jeremy, who's our Director of Real Estate Partnerships, and Thomas, our Director of Sales Engineering. So we've got industry, property, and technology insights, expertise all covered. Before we do kick in though, a bit of housekeeping. There is a chat on the right. Hopefully you can all see that. Ask any questions you have in there as we go. We'll make sure to get to them at the end, if not throughout this conversation. This webinar will be recorded, and we'll make sure to send that out to you afterwards as well. So if you miss anything or want to revisit something, you can do that as well post this. Also, for those who missed it, earlier in the week, we did run a commercial property version of this webinar. So we'll make sure to send a link to that as well in the email that follows this webinar, just in case you're interested in the commercial property side too. And then finally, before we kick off, as we wait for the last attendees to join, I just want to ask a quick question in the chat to get us all thinking and for us to get a bit of an idea around who's actually joining. So the question is very simple, yes or no answers. Do you currently have any EV chargers installed at your properties? Or if you're an electrician, have you installed any chargers at a multifamily property? Yes or no? Let us know. Look at that already coming through. This is just a great way for us to get a feel for how much knowledge there already is within the audience. And brilliant, thank you so much. I'm sure that Thomas and Jeremy will be able to have a look through that, and we'll keep that in mind as we go through these different subjects. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the experts to lead the way. Jeremy.
Awesome. Thanks, Jimmy. And thank you all for joining us today for our Effortless EV Charging Multifamily Property webinar. Again, I'm joined by Thomas Martin, our Director of Sales Engineering, myself, Jeremy Cohen, Director of Real Estate Partnerships. It's really my role in the organization to work with developers, owners, and operators of real estate to help them with their EV charging strategy, whether it be on a portfolio-wide basis, all the way down to a building-wide basis. We'll cover everything you guys need to learn, and we look forward to speaking with you guys.
Hey everybody, Thomas Martin. You can think of me like the tech guy on the call today. My goal here today is to hopefully demystify a lot of the EV charging terms and really boil it down to a very palatable decision-making process in terms of selecting technology, what you need to look out for, features that you should be prioritizing over others, in that sort. And so in today's webinar, Jeremy and I are really trying to prepare you with what questions should you be asking along the journey of procuring an EV charging project in your building. We recognize, we're not the only company in the industry, and we think it's healthy if a building talks to multiple companies. And our goal here today on the webinar is just to arm you with the right questions to ask along the way, so that you can get the valuable information that you need at the design phase, so you can execute a very turnkey and seamless project.
Perfect. So we have an action-packed agenda. We're going to talk about EV charging as a whole. It's obviously a buzzword that's going around, not even on the building-wide basis, but it's just going around the country. We'll walk you through the plan. We've mapped out just some good key questions one should consider as you go about this journey. Thomas is going to do a high-level overview of the system, which is the hardware and the software that makes EV charging, and we'll equip you guys with the path forward, what we call the plan, install, manage, and service, so that way you can think about this, again, as you go about your journey. So a little bit about Switch before we dive into it. Switch is an EV charging solutions company. We are very fortunate. We have some incredible clients who trust us with their assets, with their EV chargers, helping them with their tenant experience, the resident experience. We have over 18,000 chargers on the Switch network throughout North America with a remarkable uptime of 99.7%. And there's our CEO, Carter. So we'll talk a little bit about what we call the end-to-end solution, the design, the quote, the install, and the manage, a lot throughout this process. And if there's one thing you take away from this whole webinar, it's these 4 main pillars. So let's go about why EV charging now. And throughout the presentation, I'm going to hit you guys with a lot of stats. I think numbers do a really good job of telling the story. And I'm also going to share questions that we often hear, that I often hear, and Thomas often hears throughout just EV charging discovery as a whole. So, you know, in the US, EV sales are projected to hit 53% of all cars by 2030. That is significant. And we need to be able to prepare ourselves for this wave. And the other statistic is 80% of charging happens at home. People want to charge where they live. I think it's the key differentiator in this new vehicle experience. Instead of having to go to a gas station, people like the convenience of being able to just charge their vehicle at home. So more statistics. Switch ran an incredible survey across our portfolio of clients, and we found that within the US, multifamily residents are 2.5 times more likely to own an EV if they have charging at home. Again, a huge convenience factor. When owners and operators surveyed their multifamily residents and tenants, they found that residents say that having an EV charging system within their building would allow them to consider getting an EV. So that's big. And we'll also talk about owners and operators gauging their tenants because they're the ones who have the voice. And I think if you are a good owner and operator, you want to hear what's going on from your tenants and how you can best service them. And EV charging is incredible many to do so. In the multifamily sector, there are close to 277 active multifamily incentive programs. That is remarkable. And we'll dive into this a little bit more throughout the presentation, but each state is operating in its own silo, and there are some states that are very bullish on making this happen for owners and operators of real estate. And there are obviously statewide and countrywide incentives as well, but the multifamily programs that are available on a city and state basis should absolutely be taken advantage of. And we'll get into that a little bit more too shortly. So the plan. As I said, we're going to pepper you guys with some questions, or I'm going to pepper Thomas with some questions, because I often hear this in the field, and it's just very applicable to what's going on out there. So if you're an owner or operator of real estate, the first and the biggest question we often get is, what type of chargers are available, and what do you really need? You know, Thomas?
Exactly, yeah. And this is often a very complicated question because a lot of the hardware can do different things. And so how do you compare features and functionality? But I think just to level set and get everybody on the same page, we want to quickly understand the different levels of charging. Level 1, which is equivalent to plugging your vehicle's charger into a wall outlet, just like all of our computers are right now. This is great because it's convenient. Virtually every building has power, but the downfall is this is going to take your vehicle a few hours or a few days to charge, for that matter. And so the benefits being, if you're at a friend's house, you need a little bit of juice, you can plug in if they don't have a charger. But the problem is you're going to have to be there a while. But it's good for those emergency scenarios. But the real workhorse of EV charging and the great majority of ports out there today are what we call level 2 charging stations. And the reason for this is because they're going to charge your car in 4 to 6 hours. And so we like to call them the overnight charger. You plug it in when you get home, you go to bed. No matter what, your vehicle is full by the morning. Just like your phone, we don't really care too much about what time is your car finished or your phone finish in the night. As long as it's full by the morning, that's the user experience that's preferred. And so the same principle applies here with level 2 charging. The reason these are most common is because the infrastructure that they need is already existing in the building. They take a 240 volt or a 208 volt input, which every building has today. And so in terms of the economics of getting these in the ground, they're definitely the most efficient. But there are faster charging options. And this is where we get into what we call level 3 or DC fast charging. And so DC fast charging, as you can see in this photo, this is a large unit. It takes up a bit of space. And this is going to charge the car in 20 to 30 minutes. And so typically DC fast are along highway corridors, at shopping malls, places where you're only spending, 15 to 30 minutes to run an errand, or you want to charge quickly and move on with your road trip. And so a question we get asked a lot is, I want to put the fastest charger into my building. The answer is yes, technically speaking, we can do that, but that may not be the best solution for all the tenants in a multifamily building, because they might get home from their day, plug in, and then have to go back downstairs to move their car after 30 minutes to make room for the next person. Versus with level 2, they can plug their car in and leave it there overnight, and they don't have to think about it.
So Thomas, we know the different level chargers now, or the webinar attendees do. How many chargers should you install at a given property?
The number will depend on the type of building, the use case, whether you're a downtown or suburban building. But generally speaking, you're going to want to look at what is the future of EV charging in my building. And so we've already reviewed, we expect half of new cars sold in 2030 to be electric. We know, okay, just by walking around my parking garage, I can survey the number of EVs in my lot. And by developing a survey, this kind of clears up the unknown of what your specific building is doing. We've come to realize that the statistics that are published, and even some of the ones we use, don't take into account all the variances in the demographic in the building. And so the easiest way to solve for this is go for a walk in the parking garage and get a rough number, as well as send an email survey out to the tenants, maybe on an annual basis, just to get a gauge of who is looking into it. I will mention the Switch team does have a lot of collateral that we can help in this process. So you don't have to develop that survey yourself. We've got a few templates that you can use and certainly make it easy on the building.
So obviously people ask, how many should you install? But I think the real question is, how many can you install at the property level?
Exactly. And we talked to a lot of buildings where they've been told at one point, you cannot add any EV chargers to the building. And that, we don't like to say that until we've done a detailed electrical capacity study. And what that allows us to do is solve the unknown of what is your building performing at and how much overhead or excess capacity on the electrical infrastructure is available for EV charging. In most cases, we've been able to install more than enough EV chargers for that group of tenants. And only in a few select scenarios have we had to make some trade-offs in that installation because it's an older building, built in the 40s and 50s, things like that. But generally speaking, the message we like to communicate is you can add as many as you like. It's more of a question of how much power will they output over the course of a night while the vehicle is plugged in. And generally speaking, we like to make sure that every car is full by 6 a.m. And I'm going to show you a neat graph in a few minutes that's going to explain how we do that.
So outside of how many should you install or how many can you install, there's always the conversation of budget. And no one is naive to this. It's all about the dollars and the cents. And I think if you're an owner and operator of real estate, you're looking at your available capital on hand. Some look at EV chargers as a potential amenity. Some look at it as a revenue producer. Some look at it as a nice to have or a must have. And some want to know, is there a payback period that's needed? Maybe yes, maybe no. Some different groups look at it as what's the OPEX versus the CAPEX, because in addition to what Thomas and I will go over in terms of the hardware and the software, there's of course the installation of the chargers. And briefly, what I touched upon earlier as it pertains to the different multifamily incentive programs that are out there, how you can best leverage these and how Switch can help leverage this for you. So that way you are getting the free money that is out there to put these in. So we'll touch upon that a little bit more in a bit. The system. This is Thomas's bread and butter. I will let him take a deep dive into this. Over to you, Thomas.
Yeah. And so when looking at the technology, the question that we're ultimately trying to answer is, why is technology needed? And why can I not just, go to Home Depot and buy any charger that's there, install it, and just let the drivers charge? Is it that simple? And the answer is yes, you can do that, but you may not necessarily enjoy the repercussions that come with that. And what I mean being, if you set a charger open to anybody, it's free fuel effectively. And so you can imagine what the user behavior is going to be. We see this a lot in the field now where any free chargers are being abused, meaning people are parking there 24/7 and taking advantage of the free energy, although the intention of installing that charger was just to draw people to the property to begin with, whether it was a restaurant, a hotel, things like that. But what we found is people from surrounding areas will actually come to that location just to charge for free. And as a multi-tenant property, this is not something that this is not a scenario you want to be in. You want to have a fair and reputable process for the drivers to follow, whether they're a visitor or a tenant. And this is where we get into what we call the 4 pillars of the solution. It can get pretty detailed, but my goal here today is arm you with the right questions and little snippets of information that you want to jot down on your notepad over time, so that when you're talking to contractors or companies like us, you can ask the right questions to make sure that once it's installed, you are set up for success. And so the first of the 4 pillars that we're going to get into is going to be the EV chargers and the infrastructure associated with installing them.
So Thomas, these are just more questions that we typically get. And what should these groups be looking for? Again, you said they could be a glorified electrical outlets, but what should you be looking for when you do purchase this?
Exactly. And as you can see in the background of this photo, the chargers look different, they feel different, they have different features. But I think if there's one thing you take away from a property manager or asset management perspective, is that you're looking for a charger that participates in the open standards technology. The short for this is OCPP, meaning any OCPP charger that complies with this protocol can be operated by different networks. And the analogy I like to use here is a cell phone, where if you purchase a cell phone from Verizon, you don't have to buy a new phone to move over to AT&T. It's a matter of taking out the SIM card and putting it in a new one. And so from an asset management perspective with chargers, these things aren't inexpensive devices. And so when you're making that purchase, you're going to want to make sure we future-proof from the perspective of I've got freedom of choice for which platform manages them. So that way, if for whatever reason in the future there's a company that's operating them that does not give you adequate service, you've got the freedom as a consumer to bring in a new service company without actually having to physically change that hardware. And that's one of the downfalls of proprietary technologies, is if that charger cannot be operated by other networks and you get poor service, you have no choice but to rip it out of the ground and purchase new hardware, which can get very expensive. Going back to hardware features specifically, you can see they all look and feel differently, and they're ultimately designed for slightly different use cases. So at Switch, we're not here to recommend a specific model. We're here to guide you down the path of what's reliable and what works for the use case that you're looking for. I saw a question in the chat, a difference between a 30 amp and an 80 amp charger. Yes, it does classify as a level 2. The difference is going to come down to what are we using it for in the building. These hardware brands on screen are just kind of a short list, ones that we see deployed very often, very frequent. And so as you can see, there's some familiar names. I figured I'd throw that up just to give you a visual of what these things look like.
Thomas, other considerations that are needed in addition to the chargers, outside of just hardware, what should people be thinking about?
Well, seeing we're talking about the EV chargers and the infrastructure, we need to recognize the EV chargers are not the only piece in the equation physically. So to get EV chargers installed, we need all the supporting infrastructure. And we've talked hardware. Here's another great photo of what this might look like in an outdoor installation. But how do we get power to that charging station or that bank of charging stations? We need to think about the electrical. And this is where it's very important to work with qualified electricians and installation partners that are familiar with the trade-offs in the decision-making behind providing power to an EV charging company. We work with quite a number of national and local EV charging partners. And the reason we do that is because it's not straight as simple as simply providing power to the unit. We want to think long-term and about the future. I'm going to get into, in a few minutes, how we can use software and technology to best optimize to reduce cost on this infrastructure. And in the total scope of a project, the electrical infrastructure is usually your biggest component. And so it's typically the area we look to optimize the most. And that's where the qualified partners really comes into play. The next section, or the next component that should not be overlooked, especially for underground parking garages, is how do we provide internet connectivity to these devices? Because we're billing for energy, they do need to be connected to the outside world. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to charge by the kilowatt hour. And so internet connectivity is important. And this usually comes into play in the design phase, where we look at how much work is it going to be to provide internet to that level of parking where the chargers are, and how do we do it while minimizing cost. But definitely in the design phase, if you are talking to anybody procuring an EV charging quote for you, you want to be asking about how are we providing internet to these units in a reliable and cost-effective way. And then finally, the software. This is really the cornerstone of an EV charging project because it enables all of the functions to allow EV charging in the building to be hands-free and autonomous. We don't want additional resources from the property management or building management perspective to be allocated to upkeep and maintain these units. So the goal here is, can the software in the setup of these chargers be set up at the beginning and then forgotten and checked in on, once a year, whatever it might be. And that's what takes us to what we call the second pillar, which is the management software.
So again, we stated people look at these chargers as just glorified electrical outlets. Why do they need software now onto the chargers? What's the value of that?
Exactly. So software isn't just a way for us to do fun stuff. It's actually a way to solve problems. And so what we like to do in the design phase or when working with a property is ask the questions that property would be asking themselves once the EV charger is installed. So let's pretend for a minute we already have them installed in the building. We're going to want to ask, who has access to these chargers? How much revenue have I made on them? Are we recouping the cost of energy? How do the drivers pay for electricity? What happens if all the chargers are on at the same time? What if the driver leaves their car in the EV charging spot? And then how do I know if something breaks? Because inevitably problems do occur, and who's going to solve that? And this is what the software is here to do. It is to take all of those questions and make it easy for the building to operate and maintain that service. And so at Switch, we call it Switch OS. This is where you set up your installation to think of it as physically managing that parking space. We want to set up the rules and behaviors such that the vehicles and drivers perform in a way that complements the building rather than it being a nuisance. So for example, if your parking area is accessible to the public, you might want to set in access control, meaning only verified residents can access those charging stations. Otherwise, you might get people from surrounding neighborhoods or buildings parking in your parking spaces to use those chargers. We can also set rates based on the time of day to reflect varying energy prices, as well as the demand for that parking space to charge. For example, if we want to incentivize people to charge overnight, maybe we have a slightly discounted overnight rate. And for those who leave their car parked in that space for long periods of time, maybe we implement a loitering fee, which just allows that asset to be freed up and used by another EV driver. And so all of this is very important to understand what is possible at the beginning design phase, so that when you do implement, you are set up with a autonomous hands-free system.
So this is one of the biggest things that I hear in my world. You have assets. They were not built with EV chargers in mind. No one was thinking about this 10, 20, 30 years ago when these buildings were developed. So how do our buildings manage the electricity that will be needed for these chargers? And how are we not breaking the bank on adding a significant amount of infrastructure to get these things in the ground? Biggest questions that I personally hear. Thomas?
Yeah. And especially in where you're based in New York, where you have a lot of very high density and older buildings that were not designed with this in mind. And so this is the name of the game. If we cannot electrify some of those parking spaces, it is not an option for some of these people to own an EV. And so the question becomes, how do I install an EV charging system without breaking the bank, so to speak, within the budget, within the means of what the building is looking to spend? And this is where the infrastructure component comes into play, because the biggest line item on an EV charging project is the infrastructure and the work to get it done. And so this is where the technology comes in, allowing us to be efficient with that electrical design. And so I want to move on to a concept that some of you may or may not be familiar with. It's what we call energy management. And so the scenario here, or the textbook scenario here, is if everyone has an EV, or you have a group of EV charging in your building, or EV drivers, and they all come home in the evening to park their vehicles, and they plug in roughly in the evening when they get home, you will start to notice the peak of EV charging loads also coincide with the peak of the building. And this is where things get expensive, because whether you're in a variable rate territory or you start to maximize the infrastructure of your building, you're going to exceed what it was designed for. And so the answer is we cannot exceed that threshold that you see here on screen. You have to stay within it. So rather than focusing on how many EV chargers you can install in the building, you want to think about, how can I control when charging happens? And this graphic I have on screen clearly demonstrates that if we allow EV charging to flow rapidly, we will very soon exceed the limitations of the building. And so the question becomes, can we control when EV charging happens, and shifting it to the overnight areas, which allows us to install as many chargers as we like, but just being smart on when we choose to charge those vehicles. And then next, we want to think in our third pillar of our decision-making, the EV driver experience. And so we like to keep this simple at Switch. There's definitely a lot of fatigue out there on the driver's end for how an app every time you come to a new EV charger. And so we're not necessarily trying to do that here. From a principal's perspective, the role of the software that is EV driver facing is to do three things. They need to be able to use the station. They need to be able to pay for the amount of energy that they consume. And they need to get help in the event that there's a problem. And so these three things are what the software is designed to do, and nothing more. And so there are three ways to access an EV charger: a mobile app, an RFID card, or you could scan the QR code on the front. It brings you to a web page, and that allows you to check out and scan quite seamlessly. And in our case, we're talking multifamily. Most people actually do prefer over the RFID because they are using the same chargers in their building frequently. So in terms of the convenience and ease of access, that is preferred.
So Thomas, we touched on this slightly before, and I know it was in the pillars of the software, but how do these actual EV drivers pay for the electricity that is being used? And this is one of the biggest things I hear from owners and operators. They don't want to be crunching Excel sheets. They don't want to be managing this. They just want it to work, and they want to get paid. And I completely understand. Walk us through that.
Exactly. And so the system functions similar to a sub-metering system where you have the EV drivers pay per transaction for how much energy they consume. Switch will get that money, keep it in a virtual bank account, and on a monthly or quarterly basis, depending on the volume, we deposit those funds into the bank account of the building's choice. And so what's happening here is the building is paying for energy to power these EV chargers, but we want to make sure we're recouping that because that is going to a personal asset, AKA a vehicle. And so the role here is we're collecting the funds and depositing it back to the building, hands-free for the building operator.
More questions. And I hope that the group finds these valuable because we hear these often. How does EV charging interact with other technologies in the building? And we have heard things such as app fatigue, we have heard prop tech, we have heard climate tech. How do the EV chargers function within the ecosystem of other smart applications in a given building?
Exactly. And as some of you know, the buildings I've lived in, I know, Jeremy, the buildings you live in, they are adopting some of these smarter, more integrated technology platforms to make living in a building easier. And so one of the projects we like to highlight, just to show what's possible for EV charging, is our ability to integrate with third-party platforms. And what I mean by that is the ability for someone to start EV charging or access EV charging from an app already operated in the building. And so in this first example, it demonstrates our integration with Flash Parking, which is the chosen parking operator for Ani Group, a national developer. And with Flash Parking, the user can pay for charging and pay for parking in the same experience. And so the idea here is that you don't have to open two apps to pay for parking, then charging. It's all done through one. So it's actually quite a seamless experience. And this is where we see the future of buildings going, where you have technology platforms that bridge different services and amenities together, making the burden or the experience on the residents or tenants end as perfected, seamless, easy as possible. It's not much of a workload. And so another example of integrations is work we did with Smart One, a smart communities technology platform where their app allows you to book amenities, unlock doors, book meeting rooms, see when your Amazon packages arrive, change your thermostat. Everything related to the building can be done through that app. So rather than installing Switch chargers and forcing them to download a second app, they can actually start an EV charger through the native Smart One app. And this is the direction that we see a lot of buildings and developers going, is they want to be able to use one ecosystem that they can pick and choose which amenities they can pull into. Another burden on the property manager is that as tenants move in and out, as you have turnover naturally, they have to then sign into all these different platforms to verify accounts, create credentials, things like that. And the benefit to having it as one integrated system, you only have to go into that one system to add a new tenant or remove a tenant that's moving out. And this is a lot of positive feedback that we've heard. And so, Jeremy, I know you've got a lot of experience in this, but do you maybe want to walk through our O&M support?
Sure, happy to. One of the biggest things I hear, everyone's like, this is great. We want the EV chargers. We want them to work. It's about the reliability. So many people are so used to the gas station model. If you've had an ICE car, you pull up to the gas station, it just works. They want that same reliable from the EV charging experience as well. And I don't blame them. There's a lot of headlines in the news. You see sometimes chargers are broken down. Maybe sometimes they haven't been fixed. In a multifamily setting environment, I think that's what's in a public environment. And it's just really important to have a plan and to work with a provider or groups that have a plan and know how to execute that plan a little bit as well. So on the next slide, I believe that we have just some of that plan overall. And it's just two-pronged. The software, which Thomas has done an incredible job highlighting of all the functionalities and the benefits of that, is 24/7, 365 monitoring, where the software is going to let us know if there's any problems with the devices before an owner and operator of the real estate knows. Sometimes it's reported by a driver because they're the ones who maybe have identified the issue, but 99.7 time, or the charger uptime of 97.5%, we are able to diagnose the problem from within, since it might be a network issue, and fix that on the spot. The switch care services, as highlighted in the bottom, is that ongoing maintenance and support where we will work with qualified electricians, probably the electrician or electrical contracting group that helped to install the chargers in the first place, to come out on site should there be the need where there's a physical problem with the device, a cord, a clamp, so on and so forth. But to know that you have these options and it's not just a stranded asset is vital for uptime. So the path forward. We've spoken a lot about the different questions and considerations to take into place. Thomas has done an incredible job highlighting why managed network services as it pertains to charges is important. But the overall thesis of this webinar should be to have the plan, right? You identified your property, you've identified your portfolio, maybe you've identified what state you want to target first. You are looking at the current demand now, but you're also looking ahead for the future. Installing. Make sure you have that necessary electrical capacity. Understand what it takes to work with qualified groups who do this day in and day out, not a group that has never done this before, because there are nuances involved. The management. Again, Thomas drilled this home. Have a reliable system that is going to manage these devices. You know, now they're smart outlets and they're also revenue generating outlets. And you want to be able to understand how that works within your building's ecosystem. And lastly, the service. Understand what's available to you. I briefly touched upon the incentives earlier. We're actually going to dive into it a little bit further right now, and just understand what is available to you, both from the incentive perspective, but also the service perspective for ongoing maintenance and support. So I love this snapshot. It shows the robust network of the US and the states who are bullish on making this happen. And if you see on the far left, California has always been the leader in electric vehicle technology, electric vehicle chargers, but don't count out the rest of the states that are slowly chipping away and trying to make this happen. And through their local utilities, through the cities and the states, they are bullish on saying, hey, you know, we will give you X amount of dollars per port if you install, and X amount of money towards what we call the make ready, which is the installation cost from the electricians, the electrical contractors, to make this happen. And again, each program varies so differently from one to another. So lean on us. We have the resources, we have the manpower, we do this every single day. We will, again, look at your property, we will look at the portfolio, we will look at the state, and we'll help you navigate that just to make sure we are maximizing these incentives and rebates. Because I joke, but I also don't joke, that the money is there, grab it with both hands, because eventually the well is going to run dry. And I think historically we've seen year after year, some rebate incentive programs just start to pull back slowly and slowly and slowly. So you want to take advantage of it now. In addition to the multifamily incentives and rebate programs that are out there on a state level, through the Biden-Harris administration, they introduced the Alternative Fuel Vehicle Refueling Property Tax Credit, which is an absolute mouthful, also known as the 30C tax credit, which is an eligible up to $100,000 or 30% of the tax credit. And not every property and not every portfolio qualifies. This is determined on a census tract per zip code. We will dial it down to see where your property fits. And if it does or it doesn't, some available tracts have different yearly benchmarks. So some programs will expire in 2024, maybe some by 25, 2030, and so on. Again, lean on Switch. We have the resources, we have the manpower. We do this every single day. And we will also work to get you that tax credit amount if your property qualifies for it.
And then just being conscious of time here, I want to bring us home, but just our closing slide shows the highlights of these 4 steps that you're going to go through when procuring a project in your building: planning, installing, managing, and service. I hope we did a good job today answering, or at least providing clarity to what each of those steps look like. A lot of work goes into the planning phase, and the goal here today was to shed some light on, what that looks like, as well as once the chargers are installed, this is what you can expect and things that you could consider during the planning phase. And finally, service. 365, 24/7 support is going to be a game changer in terms of keeping the stations online and reducing the amount of headaches that you as a building operator have to deal with. Because if there's a broken cable, an issue with charging, they're going to call Switch, they're going to call the provider, they're not going to direct that query to the building. And so the hope here is that the EV charging system operates independently of the building, and it's very hands-free. And with that, we'll close it off, and we'll kick it over to Jimmy to see if we had any questions come through.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Thomas and Jeremy. That was really informative. We've got some great questions sent in the chat, and we've also got a bunch that were sent in beforehand as well. So we're going to try and get to as many as we can. Before I close off, though, a reminder, this will be sent out as a recording. So if you've missed anything, if you want to revisit anything, check your email, that will be coming. So kicking into questions first from the chat, we had a couple from Krutik. First one, are there multiple level 2 chargers like 30 amp versus 80 amp? And if so, is there a cost difference and difference in electrical impact in installing those different levels?
I saw that one come through, and I answered very briefly, but I think Thomas is better equipped to answer this one.
Sure. Both 30 amp and 80 amp do classify as a level 2. Basically, that is the spectrum of what you can install for a given charger. There's different types, makes, and models. Generally speaking, 32 does the job for multifamily because this is going to absolutely charge your car overnight. To charge faster only requires more money. And so in terms of the economics, the 30 amp category seems to be the real workhorse because there's no need to go faster because you will be parked for a minimum of 8 hours in the building anyways.
What sort of use cases might you choose an 80 amp alongside, say, 32 amps?
In our experience, 80 amp is primarily going to fleets in large vehicles. So, if a municipality operates a fleet of F-150 Lightnings, for example, they're going to be looking at the 8 amp just because they're going to be driven every day, and it does have a large battery. But typically, it's only for the heavy duty vehicles, the trucks, and the really big SUVs, like the Hummer, for example. But pretty much all other vehicles are more than satisfied with a 32.
Makes sense. And last question from the same person. What is the payback period for a standard level 2 commercial grade EV charger? I know there are a lot of differences on this, but it'd be great to just give an overview of that.
Yeah, we don't like to advertise a payback period because it's heavily reliant on usage, and every building's different, every location is different. And so we try to avoid giving people the impression that EV chargers do have a guaranteed ROI. There are definitely awesome business cases in high traffic areas where the chargers are being used all day. But there are some where there might only be a few EVs that come to the building. So it's hard to give a specific answer. And you can find lots of EV charging calculators online that kind of break down all the different variables. And I recommend going and looking into those because you can clearly see that, there's 10 or 15 variables that are all at play here. And it all depends how you set those variables. Are there incentives involved? What's the power output? What's the average charging duration? Things like that. There's definitely a spectrum.
And I know the team also has some projection calculators internally as well that we can help use. So if you would like us to actually go through and project out and go through your property and what likely scenarios might happen, you can always get in touch with us, and we'd be happy to sort of work with you and figure out some scenarios that might give you that insight. Moving on to next questions. Can you cover insurance issues? I've had developers tell me that insurance coverage with garage-based charges can be an issue, at least in the Seattle market here. So obviously we're not insurers ourselves, but we do deal with a lot of property types. So I'm wondering if we can give a brief overview of that and sort of point in any directions.
Yeah, insurance comes up quite often. To Jimmy's point, we are not the insurance experts, but we understand that property insurance and the EV chargers, go hand in hand. I actually hosted a webinar a few months back, and I think Jimmy wrote this with an EV charging attorney and a title group specializing in EV chargers. So there are subject matter experts that are a little more equipped than us as the materials provider, which I'm happy to help navigate and point you in the right direction for that. But we do find that there are insurance requirements for it, whether it be a garage, or a surface parking lot. And again, happy to guide you in the right direction with that. And we just know that insurance is definitely the trickiest one out there. So I don't want to be general or vague about it, but I would like to point you in the right direction for those who do this every day in that arena.
Absolutely. We'll make sure to link that webinar as well that went through titles, legal, and some insurance concepts in the follow-up email. But by all means, we've got some trusted sort of people that we've worked with in the past that we can point you to get some really clear answers for your situation. And then the final one from the chat, what is the difference between charger uptime and network uptime? I believe one of our slides went through those two stats for us.
Yeah, sure. I can. I'll take that one. So, think of uptime as a chain link where you have multiple links, and each one of those needs to be performing along the way for the entire system to be online. And so, charger uptime is just the ability for that charger to talk to the internet and our backend. It is just solely looking at that physical device and its ability to maintain connection to the internet. The reason we like to parse that out is because it does change model to model. And so charger uptime is a different conversation than system uptime, which would be, in the case of Switch, our service, our network, our backend, how much of the year is it online and available? And in our case, it's a very, very high percentage. And so those two pieces paired together give you an expectation of what you can experience the entire system to look like. I'll give you an example. You can have the system be online, meaning our software. It virtually never goes offline, but the charger itself might be having difficulty, in which case results in a negative experience for a driver. And so that's why we separate those two examples or those numbers separately, because they do matter.
Brilliant. And a quick question that's just come in. What is the time required to install level 2 charger if I sign today? So it'd be great, I guess, to know what the quickest sort of example of a project for installing chargers would be, but also what more the average is around.
Yeah, like I think for a standard property, it takes a day or two to install it if we're talking an underground parking garage. If you're talking outdoor parking where you got to start ripping up gardens and pavement, it's going to add some time just with the civil work. But generally speaking, from the time people write POs to the time it gets done, it's usually within a month. Most of that time just being, getting the material to site and making sure all the work is coordinated with the installer and scheduling. So generally speaking, not that long.
Brilliant. And then a couple of quick ones. I'm just looking at the time, so we'll try and answer them very quickly and then get to anything else. But does Switch provide CCS/NACS port converters, or are the EV owners expected to use their own?
We do, but only for level 2 charging stations. The DC fast charging adapters are going to be carried by the EV drivers. And the reason for that is just an expensive piece of hardware. If you start putting them in the field, they will get stolen. But for level 2 stations, we have an adapter that fits on top, giving drivers the option for either CCS or NACS.
And then finally, do we have an approximate TTR? I'm assuming time to resolution when a charger goes down.
So the Switch software, our team gets notified instantly when a charger goes offline. We do have a lot of automated software that will try and recover that unit by itself. And if it does need to be escalated, we do have a dedicated Switch representative going in and looking at that. Usually within 10 or 15 minutes, we know if it's a serious problem or not. A lot of issues get solved from somebody's desk, meaning it's a software fix. But in the event that they do need a physical repair, the process typically looks like getting in contact with the on-site contact, verifying that there's a problem, whether it's a broken cable, something's gone wrong, and then we issue a fix to the local support personnel that we're working with. We cover all 50 states, and typically it's within a day or two, depending on the level of priority.
Brilliant. Okay then. Well, to finish us off, to wrap it all up, any insights from Jeremy and Thomas just around multifamily properties and EV charging, what you're seeing out there, any directions or any general challenges you're seeing?
Yeah, I think everyone is on their own journey. I speak to groups, whether they're, small groups, mid-market groups, national REITs, you name it. And what I find is not everyone is in the same boat. You have some large groups that have deployed chargers already. Maybe 5-10 years ago, they were the early adopters of some of the early technology. And since then, the technology has changed drastically. Some of the highlights that Thomas was speaking about, like OCPP, having the ability to change providers if you're not happy, I think some of these groups are running into because maybe they purchased proprietary hardware early on in those days. I'm finding some groups that want to look at their whole portfolio and say, okay, where do we begin? Do we begin in, on the East Coast where some of the incentives and rebates are so lucrative, and maybe we leave some of the West Coast ones, for later down the road? And then some I just see just want to dip their toe in the pond. They just maybe want to start with one building and say, you know what, I happen to have been at this building on Thursday and I saw that there were 10 Teslas there, and I have no EV chargers. Where are those people charging right now? Maybe I should put a charger in or two. So I'm seeing it on this wide macro level, all the way boiled down to this real micro level. And it doesn't matter where you are in that journey because it's never too late to start. I think that's the whole point of this. Is this wave is happening. It's here to stay. And you just want to be prepared for it. You don't want to be left at the end of all of this saying, I didn't take advantage of the rebates and incentives. I didn't take advantage of the 30C, because as I joked earlier, the well's going to run dry. And all of a sudden you find that your tenants have these EV cars and now they might be moving out of the buildings because you didn't satisfy that need early on. So take the time, take a look at the residents and tenants who are at the building, take a look at the parking lot, saying maybe, don't install just for now, install for later down the road. So that's what I'm just seeing on this bigger level through the real estate industry.
Brilliant. And Thomas, any last thoughts on the technology side of things?
No, I think we covered most of it. I'll just kind of echo Jeremy's sentiment, to which, we're here to help. Don't hesitate to reach out and ask questions. We've got a large team here at Switch that can engage and help navigate the uniqueness of every situation. Every building's different, every county, every state, every province. And so we've got the team coast to coast that's here to do it. So,
well, thank you so much. Thank you for your expertise, and thank you for all the attendees for joining. I hope you found that really valuable, and we'll make sure to send all of this information to you. Please get in touch. Jeremy's details are on the screen and in the chat. Again, those will be sent to you. But we hope to hear from you, and have a great day. See you all.
Thank you for joining, everyone.